Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Today's episode concludes our Oscar series, where film industry professionals discuss the nominees in their category of expertise. And we're releasing it just in time for the Academy Awards, which will air this Sunday, March 27th. The last of our technical awards is for cinematography. I'm excited to discuss this year's nominees with our guests. Returning to the show is director of photography and director Patrick Cady, who last joined us to talk about Bosch. Patrick, nice to see you again.
Great to see you.
And making his below-the-line debut is Shawn Peters, whose cinematography can be seen on The Last Days of Ptolemy Gray, currently streaming on Apple TV+. Shawn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Listeners at home, you can look these guys up on the Internet Movie Database. If you start on the page for Below the Line, you simply click through to the film credits of our guests. The 5 films nominated for cinematography are Dune, Nightmare Alley, The Power of the Dog, The Tragedy of Macbeth, and West Side Story. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this a warning. Gentlemen, let's hop right in. Let's start with Dune, cinematography by Greg Fraser.
Well, small budget movie, small format film, photography, not epic at all. I finally got to see it in IMAX about a week and a half ago, and had already seen it with my family. My daughter really wanted to see it with me, but finally getting to see it in IMAX. The thing that I took away that was really interesting was Greg Fraser, the cinematographer. They actually built some sets out in the real world, so they had to use sunlight, and which means you're telling your director, and your director's agreeing, okay, we've got 1 hour for this shot. I mean, they're not I come from very low budget features to start, so it wasn't like we have 1 hour for the scene, but it'd be like we have 1 hour for this frame. And you can tell that they're doing that kind of thing. And then the thing I noticed seeing it in IMAX, which I hadn't noticed before, was the way they were moving my eye in the frame. If it was widescreen or if it was IMAX, it would seem like it would go to IMAX without me quite noticing. And then there would be something in an upper right corner or somewhere in the big format square frame that suddenly made me realize I was looking at it in IMAX. I was surrounded. And I just thought that was an interesting, those are the things that get me the most excited about being a cinematographer and being a director, is that collaboration where you're telling this story and you're moving the audience's eye around the story, and that they're paying that much attention to the format they're going to present those scenes in is really amazing, on top of all the things that are obvious.
I only saw it on my television, unfortunately.
Now, did they change the format on the television, or they keep it one like 16:9 or scope? Or
I think it's scope. I'll be honest with you, I didn't particularly pay attention. I was just sort of immersed in it.
You get sucked into the movie.
I sucked into it, so I didn't even think about what the aspect ratio was when I was watching it. But one of the things that is very difficult with big special effects films is Ptolemy Gray had a lot of VFX, more than I've ever done before. But some on this scale, one of the things I've seen that sometimes can go awry is sort of the pre-planning of how those VFX are going to interact with what you guys are doing on the stage, what they're doing on the stage, and what they're doing lighting wise. And I just felt like, one of the it was really smart in terms of like the skies were mostly overcast, so they had this like gray sort of dust-filled desert sky that really allowed the lighting to, the sun especially to be diffuse in a way that allowed for lighting on stage without it, trying to mimic some crazy sun.
And people look great in that kind of, if you're setting that up as, or sun coming to a room and bouncing around everywhere and then suddenly just softly hitting someone the right way, you still feel connected. The other thing I thought was really interesting is how many extreme close-ups there were in a movie that was initially designed to be seen on such a big format, and it didn't bother me. Sometimes when I see a movie on a big screen and it's all close-ups, it feels like maybe the team is from television and they don't understand, they don't need to do it or something. But in Dune, I felt like it was all story connected, and I felt like every shot was pushing the story they're trying to tell, that they were telling successfully. Every shot was pushing that story ahead And so when they went to a screaming close up of someone, it had impact. There was a reason for it.
I think I was reading in American Cinematography that they really were careful about their like lensing their close-ups for the IMAX.
Yeah.
The focal lengths that they used, and they really were making sure that what they were watching on the monitors and stuff for close-ups was in the IMAX format, so that they wouldn't do exactly what you just said, like an extreme close-up that would be crazy on like a
right
never big screen that you're watching.
Yeah, but they're still pretty.
Yeah,
there's some really, really close stuff and smart inserts and things. But yeah, you can tell there's just this level of craft, and it's so fun to think of, that Greg then also shot the Batman, which looks like it was shot with lenses that were dropped on the floor. I love
to watch that. I haven't seen that yet, but
I really like the look a lot.
I'm sure it's great. I mean,
Yeah.
Dune is my favorite, I think, just as a spoiler for my favorite for best cinematography. I just think it sits on the mastery level of, even what you see in the distance, what the eye sees in the distance in those big sets.
Yeah.
How they're making sort of light. It almost feels, obviously it feels like another planet, but that kind of desert light, believable, still having beautiful keys, I think it's a masterclass.
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
And then, some of those things where, obviously there were sets, but the room just felt the way the light was falling on people and the key lights were falling on people. It was just so round, it wasn't hard and one directional. It was just really beautiful and soft. And, that's not easy. Just the technicality of it was overwhelming. It was just great to watch. That's the reason why it's my favorite.
And they built a lot of things practical. Denis, and it's funny, the IMAX screening I saw, Denis and Greg were there, and he talked about having been given a masterclass by Roger, and coming from Blade Runner to this, where they had to construct a lot of things in visual effects in Blade Runner, but Roger's very good about stretching the lighting that would be coming from those effects in the scale of what they would be in. And Greg said that the visual effects supervisor was one of his closest allies, because they would start pitching. Someone would say, well, we should do this in visual effects. And the visual effects supervisor was like, no, it won't feel correct. If I can extend, but you should build 2 here for real. And then I can extend it, and it shows.
I was thinking about, when I watched it, I was thinking about, even though the movie wasn't successful, I thought what Bradford did in Solo, in terms of how the interaction with the light on the faces and the VFX.
He's so good with faces, Bradford Young. I mean, come on.
And it was very similar to me in terms of the execution between the pre-thought of the visual effects world and what they were doing on stage, and the quality of light and how things matched up so nicely.
Well, it's interesting watching these shows shooting in a volume too now, because that's all new technology for us to play with. And they supply a certain amount, but then if you've got to bring hard light in, you've got to poke it through the volume kind of. And how do you do that nicely?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't, there's a lot we can say about Dune, but it's, I think it was great.
Probably have to move on at a certain
move
point.
on to some,
You brought it up, Patrick, and made some comparisons to Blade Runner 2049. And that's come up a couple of times as well, where there's some similar visual style. Talk to me a little bit about collaborating on cinematography with a director who appears to have this vision that he's bringing to the entire film.
Well, the interesting thing about that, seeing that screening and having him talk afterwards, was he talked about how Dune was a book he'd wanted to make into a movie his whole life, and the composer too, and the terror of doing that. He wasn't worried as much about disappointing other people as much as disappointing his 14-year-old self, right? And he also said, the person running the Q&A at the screening I saw kind of asked, how do you decide what your project you're going to next? Because he's going into these progressively bigger and bigger projects. And he said he feels like he's learning on every film the ability to then go to that next film. And so the idea that he's been progressing in this scale, and now is in the the stratospheric scale, but you can tell that that's the same filmmaker that's made these earlier movies of his, and he's staying connected to the story. And then I think it all becomes about what technique keeps us glued to the story as much as possible. This thing Shawn's talking about, where you can tell how complete that approach is. So it's an interesting thing. your job as a director is to fine tune everyone's focus and answer the same question 100 times. And so you better like the answer you have, right? And then drive with what's in your budget. You're driving to get those answers. I can't imagine in Dune, there's definitely got to be conversations about, well, what is the budget of making this giant set? How much of it do we need to make? And then how much of it is, there's these behind the scene photos of the room where these guys are having tea, and then there's like a sneak attack comes in, and they built or found, I can't even remember. Do you know, Shawn, that column room? And then the rest is Greg with these giant pieces of diffusion flung off construction cranes. And you're playing that game all the time. And Denis knowing that that's the thing he has to do to get this level of movie made. I think he's going to keep going in that direction, but I'd be really curious if he takes a break from one of these giant epics and makes a tiny movie again.
Yeah.
Every cinematographer in the world is going to be lining up for that job, and he'll be able to pick whichever one he wants.
I find that, but certain cinematographers, they're that elite class. I think once they step on set, I don't think anyone says anything to them at all. I think Greg Fraser is one of those people who's like, I'm not going to really, we're going to shoot here for an hour. I don't think he's a line producer or AD arguing about time and money.
Well, they probably talked about it ahead of time and said, look, if we don't get the whole thing in that hour, we'll come back this hour tomorrow. It's really funny. For a long time, I wondered how they made What's Eating Gilbert Grape look so fantastic. I didn't know if Sven Nykvist had like a bag of magic powder he carried around, or what the trick was, because it's a low budget movie and every frame is beautiful and the quality of light on people's faces is insane. And then a production designer I was working with was like, I was a PA on that movie and I can tell you the answer. I was like, okay. And he said, we went around on the Scout and we were shooting in this tiny little town. And Sven said to the director, we can shoot on this side of the street from this time to this time. And they just schedule it so if they didn't get the scene by the end of the day, they would come back the next day and finish it.
Nice.
On a tiny budget.
How often do you get that?
You don't, but if you trade in a bunch of your equipment budget for standing in the right place in the right weather and add to your schedule days, you can do it. But who does? I mean,
very few nowadays. I think, I don't know. It's like people are more and more afraid. The budgets are the time to shoot is getting more and more cut. And I do find that, I don't know if that's regressive, especially in that mid-level sort of $10 to $20 million movie.
I think that's almost the trickiest spot. If you're shooting $1 million movie and you have 24 days, you all know what movie you're on. and having shot one recently, and if the script is really good, I basically shot one of those and it was more money because the cast was really amazing. But like, okay, we have to schedule and we have to plan every single shot, because if we stub our toe for 20 minutes, our whole day, like our whole week goes down the drain. And a lot of pressure gets put on you as a cinematographer.
It's probably a good time to plug. You hire good assistant directors as well, I think.
Oh, amen, brother.
Listen, we'll talk about that another time. Because I have some questions about that.
Oh, see, I've been really, really lucky on Bosch. I'm going to shout out to Trey Batchelor, and oh my God, it's a godsend. Someone who's standing next to you and understands you cannot have take your time in the morning and rush around like your head's on fire in the afternoon. You just got to run at it all day long until you're done.
Well, I'm going to take us on to the second film on our list. That's Nightmare Alley, cinematography by Dan Lauston.
This one I have to sadly admit I have not seen this one on the big screen yet, but it was ridiculously impressive in my little home movie theater.
I'm going to admit that I haven't seen any of these on the big screen.
Oh yeah. For me, it's all about the color palette, and that's so interesting because they made a black and white version, which I haven't seen yet. And in some ways, I know with the digital intermediate step where you're sitting in a coloring room, a strong color palette gives them a ton of weapons later for the black and white, because you can be like, oh, let's make it like we're wearing a red filter. Let's make it wearing a blue filter. If those colors are saturated in your quote unquote negative, right? If in your raw image or your basic image that the camera caught is really saturated, you can grab those colors and play with them later. And so I don't know if I'm doubting that was the tactic, but I'm guessing that was a fun advantage in the process later. this is me talking completely out of supposition. I
No,
don't
it could
know the
be.
answer.
It makes sense. I'm not a. I gotta admit, and I've used it, but I'm not always a big fan of digital black and white when I see it, especially on a large scale, big screen. It always feels very digital to me. I guess I'm just so used to watching black and white films on that were shot on film, And I think it's okay. I think it's great. I think there was a definite thought when you watch a film that was shot in color, and then you see it in black and white. You definitely have more respect of the shape of shadows and form and light and how they interact. You're not distracted by the color in that way. So you definitely see you see the direction. You kind of see what the cinematographer is doing. Just even the densities of different lights and the densities of different shadows. So that's interesting to me, but I'm always a little disappointed when black and white films aren't shot on black and white film. I like the commitment.
I am a huge old film noir fan myself, and
Yeah.
for a long time I've screened movies on film in my backyard, and it's the only way to fly to see those, even in 16 millimeter, which is where I started. And now my very understanding wife has let me have a 35 projector in the back craft shack, and we do these outdoor movies. Yeah, it's really, really fun.
Yeah, I got to get my life together. I have none of these things.
Well, I can certainly tell you how to get started in 16. It's really easy. The thing I noticed about Nightmare Alley was the way they were shaping people's faces in that kind of noir hard light way. And when you have a cast like this movie does, you can do that. I mean, everyone's face can take, a pretty hard directional key very, very well. The funny thing was, is I had watched the original just like 2 weeks before this came out, and I was able to see this. And the original is also fantastically shot. So I really, my eye just went to that kind of hard key lighting style, that kind of hard light style.
Yeah, it's not used enough these days. I think it's fun.
Yeah, it's great. And you're telling your actors they have to hit that mark they rehearsed, because if they don't, they're not going to look good.
It's gonna be crazy. Yes, that's nice. Sometimes you can see that, which bothers me a little bit, that you have to hit a mark, and you can see sometimes.
Oh, them being uncomfortable and doing it
right into a key like super hard, and sometimes as a filmmaker you can see it, but still, I like the mastery of that. I think it's wonderful.
One of my very first movies I ever shot was one of the actors was a soap actor, and he was doing this thing where in rehearsals he would just come to his mark, and I was lighting kind of a hard key style, and then on the takes he would hold off just shy of his mark until his line, and they would say his line and lean in, and your eye would go right to him, right? Because as he was speaking, he would light up. And he did it for like a day. I think I caught it after lunch one day. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Look at that. And so I went over and said, so how many cameras are you used to working with? And he said, about 3. I said, so this is kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. And he looked at me. He said, what do you mean? I said, you're leaning in when you're saying your lines into your key light. He's like, oh, yeah, I probably am. He didn't even know he was doing it.
That makes perfect sense. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I thought it was beautiful too. I thought the color palette was amazing, and I liked all the hard light
and the mix of lighting. The other thing that I thought was interesting, and I personally don't know if I fully agreed with it all the time, was the camera's always moving. Like there's always some motion.
Mm-hmm.
And I every time I feel a rule, it's like the movies where there's no cuts, and like Birdman drove me a little crazy because there were a couple times I would have loved a cut to see someone's reaction. And this is the much more subtle rule, but it is something that I picked up on before hearing interviews where they said that they had purposely done it. It's like, oh, the camera's always moving. There's always a little something.
I kind of prefer camera movement to have a narrative, a beginning, middle, and end narrative. But
right, yeah.
Energetically, how it can work too.
That was a nice way to put that, Shawn, that the motion to have a narrative. Every scene should have a narrative, right? Every scene has to have that arc. And yeah, and so I remember coming onto a set that Paris Barkley was directing on, and I know him from a long time ago, and I said, hey, how's it going? He's like, oh, just sitting back here watching cameras at 200 millimeters, just styling back and forth for no reason, because that was the look of the show he was on.
But yeah, that sometimes can be interesting. I don't think I was bothered by it in this particular thing.
But
I think in general, I'm always like, why? If I'm watching some like big superhero movie, I'm like, why is that camera? Why is there a slider on this shot for no reason?
because there's stuff happening.
It's like literally a dialogue scene between two people, and the camera's always. Is there a purpose for that?
Yeah, trust your audience. And certainly in Nightmare Alley, it was a really subtle thing that I noticed late in the movie, that it was happening. It might have been actually about midway through, when the main character is going through all the through the carnival itself. I noticed, oh, we're cutting out, but we're not cutting out on a shot parking. We're cutting out on it still moving. So I feel that they wanted, and I've since heard interviews where I guess correctly, but they want you to feel like he is like, oh, this is a world I could succeed in, that I find interesting.
Next film on our list is The Power of the Dog, cinematography by Ari Wegner.
I love this movie.
I enjoyed. My friend of mine was the ACAM study cam up on this guy from New Zealand that I worked on once on a series. So I got a chance to sort of sit with him. He's in New York working on another Netflix film. So we had lunch like maybe a month ago or so. And so I had a chance to get a little insight on things. But what I loved about this film, and which I'd like to do more in my work, is sort of meditative, whimsical lighting and cinematography moments that were coming in and out of the film. You know, there's this one shot in particular I can remember when the young man he's doing his little artwork thing in the beginning of the film, and it's beautiful. Obviously, it's a beautiful sort of light, like an edge with like the light fill on his skin. It's really nice, but there's something that happens with the light when he puts his hand up in the material, and it's just a moment of sort of whimsy and then there's like a little rainbow projection on his back when they do the reverse. I always like films when you have, you know, these sort of flights of fancy, sort of whimsical, dust in the air, in the light, sort of meditative moments that I thought were really beautiful. Sort of Jane Campion type thing too, you know. She does a lot of that.
Yeah, to me, I feel like it's a love letter to, and an addition to Terrence Malick's early movies, you know, where you feel the real world as a potentially beautiful and potentially harsh and dangerous place, depending on who you are. And that's what the movie is playing with. So it's one of those things where the visual storytelling is laying right on top of that, the story of the movie itself. And the thing I loved about the movie was I thought I knew where it was going, and then it went somewhere else that was surprising. And the surprise of the obvious, right? It was like, oh, because about halfway through, I was like, I really think I know where this is going. And then 10 minutes later, I was very surprised at where it went, and so happy that it went there. Yeah. Cody Smith-McPhee, I got to direct him in a show called Interrogation, and he was fabulous in that show. He was such a wonderful actor to work with. And then to see him just freaking knock this out of the park as well. I hope he wins. I would love for him to get this recognition. He's a real talent. And
is he nominated for Best Supporting?
Yeah, he's nominated. So I'm excited. I'm super excited for him. And he's just a real talent. And the thing I wanted to talk a little bit about this is, I don't know if non-cinematographers know how tricky it is to make the interiors work as well as they work in here when they're competing against these shockingly beautiful, huge, wide exteriors. And for those two things to feel all the same piece, and even the direction of the light and the way the sun plays inside to outside, that's a real skill.
Even looking inside, from inside to outside the window.
Bingo, there it is.
Really got it. It's beautiful, and it doesn't feel like you know, this sort of old school matte kind of thing that it used to do. It feels like, you know, this, you know, probably a lot of ND on the window if there's a window, but it's so balanced. You know, I was really impressed by that too. The quality of it all the way around, and those exteriors were always super beautiful.
It kind of had that feeling of something that Roger shoots, where you're like, oh, he got lucky again. Every shot.
Every
you know,
shot. Yeah, exactly. You're like, damn. Yeah, I wish I had that luck.
Well, you know, I don't think it is. I think it's crafting those images. What's interesting about any of these movies, but I certainly thought about it, and Shawn mentioned exactly the thing that is the trickiest, is that looking inside to the outside, and that the landscape is such a big part of this movie, The Power of the Dog. If you're curious, if you're a filmmaker that's not a cinematographer, just take your phone and try to make a frame that has the exposure of what this has, and you'll understand how much work a cinematographer has to do to make it work. She's doing amazing work in this movie to make these frames look the way they look.
Amazing.
And to be balanced as much as they are. And I'm assuming without the, I think about the budgets of these movies when I'm watching them too. It's when you're judging something for awards, it's always interesting to think about how it was made in addition to what the result was. And you have no idea if this was a small budget where they waited for things to be perfect, or a huge budget, or it just, every frame is working. Every frame makes sense and helps tell the story. And that's not always easy. And if you don't think about it, then they've done their job. Everything's working.
I understand it was a fairly long shooting schedule from a friend. I can't remember exactly how long, but they had some time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that they could wait for these clouds. I have a frame up here, a still frame of wide of the house. It's just like,
it's ridiculous.
Shocking. Yeah.
And so it is New Zealand too. So I feel like some of this is like an advantage of just like, you're in New Zealand with these clouds.
Step one, go to New Zealand.
Yeah. I had to shoot in Atlanta. Atlanta. Yeah, not the greatest aesthetic place on the planet, exterior aesthetic place on the planet.
I did a TV movie once in Puerto Rico, and I remember looking at the sun path, and you slowly start tilting your head up, right? And your head goes up and up and up, because everything's, you've got a magic, you don't have a magic hour. You have like a magic 10 minutes as the sun is just coming up, and then bang, it's almost dead overhead the rest of the day because you're so close to the equator.
Well, it's interesting to compare the vistas in Power of the Dog with our next film, and that's The Tragedy of Macbeth, cinematography by Bruno Dubanel.
I have a little bit of a Bruno Dubanel story. Before I was a cinematographer, I was in music business. And I went to film school before I was in music business. I just left because, whatever life circumstances, but so I was a big fan of Bruno Dubanel from Amelie, obviously, and A Very Long Engagement, all those films. And I had a chance to be on set with him during the filming of Across the Universe, the Julie Taymor film. And I used to manage an artist that was in the film. And so because he was in the film for several days, and with the artist I was working with, I just left him and just hung around with Bruno, and he allowed me to sort of just hang around with him, and just being able to sit and watch his sort of what he was doing, was a big spark for me in becoming a cinematographer sort of believable for myself.
That's amazing. And was there some way he thought about light?
He would never remember this, by the way. It was so random. He would never remember.
My first movie, I was the camera intern for Roger Deakins, and he gave me advice that literally changed the course of my life into where it is now. He does not remember giving me that advice. We've talked about it.
Yeah, and I've seen, I saw Bruno one time. I don't think I spoke to him one time. I wasn't next to him. I just was like on the set, far away, looking at his monitor. Of course, he signed my DVD copy of A Very Long Engagement. That was the only interaction we had. So he would never remember. I just was able to be on set. But anyway, this film, my feeling about this film, disappointed it wasn't shot on black and white film. That's my first disappointment, because I can kind of feel the video in it. But I think it's a masterclass of like using movers, on set.
Can you explain to the non-cinematography audience what you mean when you say movers?
Yeah, mover is like a theatrical light, I guess, in layman's term. It's like what you'd see on a stage or in a concert, where you see sort of a light that's casting a beam of light and it's moving around. In a concert with spotlight on a person or lights going crazy in the background for a rock and roll concert. Those are movers. These environments, these all those lights that are coming through those tunnels and all those lights that are cutting through are all just like gobos and like cut out, like them shaping movers and making them to the shape of the architecture, and working with the production designer to create, cuts for the movers to extend those shadows and those lights. And I just think that is an incredible feat.
Yeah, I remember one of the early uses was Maddie used them for Inside Man, right? Because they couldn't rig in the bank, so he rigged them up in the ceiling and was able
Mhm.
to. It's really smart.
I use movies a lot in Ptolemy Gray.
Oh yeah,
Secret.
yeah, it's smart. I know that Greg talked about using them on his Rogue One, right? Greg shot Rogue One, and he used movers there because those directors are changing things all the time, and so he can be sitting next to his dimmer board operator and changing the lighting to what the shots are changing to as it's all happening.
And especially if you're trying to make a stage set believable. I don't think in this case it was a believability issue. It was more just a really graphic disability to make. There's no way you're going to get a light to an actual lamp to cut that, to make that, sort of archway, cast a hard white light on the floor like they did, without it being a mover with the shape cut out in the mover. And so I think the graphic nature of building the world, just using minimal structure and then lighting and shadow to create a world, to create this castle is a pretty amazing feat for me.
I also feel like he did such an amazing job with Francis's face and with Denzel's face. The close-ups are really amazing, but also theatrical. And I think that's maybe they seemed a little more matte than might be normal. And I felt like that was actually normally I wouldn't be a fan of that, but it seemed like such a perfect fit in the theatrical sets and the theatrical lighting that, and you can tell they're bringing beautiful, big, soft, rappy, soft things, but just positioning it so their downstage eyes just getting a little something. So it's still very shaped. It's all purposefully crafted, and it's okay with showing you that it is and exploring a three-dimensional stage world instead of a proscenium arch world. I thought that was pretty phenomenal. Do you remember when you were watching Bruno on Across the Universe? Is there something you saw, like what got connected in your brain besides the fact that you could actually do it, about the way he thought about lighting or framing? Or
The particular scene that I was watching, because they shot that scene over a couple of days, was that he had these huge, I don't know if they were gem balls, but they were like these huge lanterns. They were huge, soft, round sources. And then you'd always have like something soft and close. And then he would have like something kind of hard in the distance, raking somewhere. So it was always this sort of combination of this soft, sort of close thing that was happening on people. And then there was like this hard thing in the back. So that was like a thing I learned right away, from him. I was like, oh, I'll try that. And sort of what Darius Kanji does, like in Seven and a few places, you see these smaller, in Bruno's case, they were bigger, but in some smaller, softer sources that are closer to people. And then there's like harder things in the back, which is a very, very cool technique, I think. That's what I learned from him.
I got to gaff a music video in the late 90s with Darius. And we lit it all with Kino tubes and Maglite flashlights. And it was such a fun way to learn how his brain thought about lighting, thought about metering. It was a really, really fun. It was several days.
What a gift for you.
Oh my gosh. It was a masterclass for me, and I was getting paid to do it. It was the craziest thing. Yeah, really. And we talked a lot about the way he was exposing film to be transferred to video. It was a long time ago, and we were transferring on Y front Bosches. And if your negative was actually a little thinner, you had less noise in the transfer. So it was this really precise exposure placement. It wasn't like, overexpose it and figure it out later. It was this very precise approach. And it's nice. It's always nice to see. And of course, all these movies, we're seeing that.
Yeah. Bruno, man, Bruno's also just like a master of, color too, and sort of color temperature. I didn't think I saw much coming from above, right? And my memory is like everything was sort of lower. All the sources were sort of lower, which makes sense.
It's nice to set up parameters. Those rules end up feeling like a truth, even if they're not following what would actually happen in a room. If you're doing it all the same for the scene, then it's something about it feels right.
So the film was incredible. The cinematography and the accuracy and the technique and the theatrical lighting is really, really different. It's really a feat.
We've talked about collaboration a couple of times, and obviously working with all the different departments. Is it fair to say, though, in a film like Tragedy of Macbeth, which is sparse and specific, that collaboration is even more important, or do you think there is a difference?
I feel like collaboration is the whole thing. If you're not interested in collaborating, you should be painting or making sculptures or expressing yourself visually some other way. You could be a still photographer out on the street by yourself. But to pick a medium where you can easily have 100 people in a giant space making something together, you better be okay with that. Like, you better be okay with hearing their opinions and having ideas. And
Yeah, you're right on track. I don't think there's like a sort of I don't think there's like a scale of how collaborative you can be based on any particular project. I think it's all the same level. It's a marriage too. It's like a weird. I always feel like strangely, and I don't mean this in a sexual way, but I always feel strangely attracted to the person I'm collaborating with. Like, there's like a heart connection. It's almost like you're dating for that period of time, even if they're, whatever your, gender assignment or sexuality doesn't matter. You're kind of attracted to this person, and so it always becomes like this weird sort of vulnerable, heart connected collaboration, no matter what the film is. And
I think that's a really smart thing to say. I think that's exactly right. And there's also this level of, when you're a kid and you find some other kid who likes the same thing you do, and now you're going to go off and imagine something together, right? Like, you might go play in someone's backyard and pretend you're on a spaceship together or something. There's an extension of that joy of being able to create with someone, and you need to trust that person, and that person and you need to also be okay with saying something out loud that might be completely different than what they were thinking. And you just hope that they don't shut you out because of it, but instead are like, no, that's not what I was thinking, but it was this. And you never know. I always find the most interesting part of prepping is the day after you've been talking about the big problem you have, when you're brushing your teeth the next morning and your brain goes, or you could do it this way. Right, and then you can come in, you kind of meet in the van the next morning, you have an idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's always like that. And it is joyous at times and stressful. Making films it's not a natural way to work. It's almost like the intensity, the amount of presence you have to have for the amount of hours that you have to be that present and that sort of, at least emotive and clear, and it's probably the same level of going to war or being in a war. Who else is that present for 12 hours a day? And acutely present, and able to make decisions. No one, only a general maybe, So I find that it's not a natural way to be. So you tend to, you brother up or sister up or whatever up with people because it's an intense situation to be together in.
Yeah, and you really need to have each other's backs. And I feel the cinematographer, everyone thinks their role is very unique because it is, but I do find, having directed and DP'd, that as a director, there is a moment you can kind of let go as the cinematographer is lighting the set, and you can let go and make sure that you're not missing something, or let your mind wander just a little in case some idea that's still rattling around in there hasn't come up yet, that you need to hear before you're driving home at night and go, oh, I should have done this, right? But as the cinematographer, you're setting up the shots, you're lighting the shots, and then you're shooting those shots, and you're paying attention.
So you're always on.
100%. Yeah, you're always on. And so I started asking to not have lunch meetings years and years ago. And I actually try to eat a really light lunch and go get like a 15-minute nap in the middle of the day. And that changed my whole world. Like, it really helped a lot. I felt like much snappier the second half of the day, just giving yourself 15 minutes, because people don't realize
how many questions you have to answer every 5 seconds,
Yeah. And how you have to very calmly explain to people why they have to get something done right away, or everything's going to fall apart.
Exactly. And so, yeah, so it's a heavy job. But So to answer your question, is it's never, the intensity never wavers. It's always the same collaborative intensity, I think.
And like a marriage, you find what works in that relationship. I've worked with directors who they want to dictate the shots very specifically, but they don't care at all about the lighting in a way. Not don't care, but that's the realm that you expand inside. I worked with, it was John Sayles on Sunshine State, and I would keep pitching him additional shots, and he kept saying no, no, no. And after about a week, I said, John, do you want me to stop pitching you shots? He's like, no, but I'm only going to say yes to like 1%. And that was a generous amount. I think there are 2 shots in that movie that I pitched to him, and everything else he'd already planned out.
Well, the 5th film on our list is West Side Story, cinematography by Janusz Kaminski.
Yeah, I mean, it was beautiful. It's theatrical lighting. I couldn't tell. I was like, I'm assuming all those exteriors were on a lot, right? Somewhere, all the West Side, all the New York City streets felt like a Hollywood lot. But
I think they might have been lit up like that, but I can't tell either. I mean, they're big. So my daughter is a dancer. She's been dancing since she was 4. She's in high school now. And we love movie musicals. And the thing that both she and I noticed, and it's the craziest thing, and I don't know if a cinematographer or certainly a non-filmmaker would pick up on how precise it is, but some of the match cuts in this movie, the camera couldn't be 1 inch higher or 1 inch lower and be any more perfect. Like just the height and lensing of some of the moves. And there were a couple times that it literally made both me and my daughter go like, oh my gosh, like holy cow. And it's not something I was expecting to feel or see when I was watching that movie. You really sense this, okay, these are also the same filmmakers that made Munich and these other movies, or Catch Me If You Can, which is also full of all these perfectly shot scenes where the camera operation, Spielberg is the person behind it, but Janusz has been achieving it for so long for him. We kind of think of them as a unit. These shots where if you technically knew what it took to make those shots, your head would pop off, but you don't think about it because they stay attached to the story so well. You don't notice like, oh, the camera just went from inside the car to outside the car and then panned around inside the car in a way that
it's impossible.
I don't know how they did it.
I think that's what I noticed too, was like, wow, this execution of camera is really incredible. From my little experience, I know that that's a big team effort. There's a lot of wheels. There's a lot of like wheels turning at the same time, a lot of a very oiled engine, a very greased engine that's operating at its highest level to do that.
Yeah, and it's so crisp. And what's interesting to me too is the lighting style is a lighting style I don't myself naturally find myself drawn to doing or wanting to do. And it's often easy if it's something you don't do, you might discount it. But instead I sit there and go, how do you do it that way? It is so theatrically lit, but it's still itself. It's still the story that they're making together. And so it all works.
I often find myself in a similar position where I feel like I might look at something and be like, that's not really what I do necessarily, but I appreciate it. I appreciate the level of craft. I appreciate the level of, and I really like theatrical lighting, honestly. I like it. I even like to do it when I can, and when I have the opportunity to do it. But you can see levels, Janusz Kaminski, it's obviously to see levels. When you're a cinematographer, especially someone who's somewhat young in my career, I see levels, I'm like, that's the level. And I'm always like, wow, it's nice to witness it. And everything doesn't have to, some things need to be theatrical, and that's fine. And we should have diversity in what we're able to watch, in terms of cinema and execution. I tend to maybe go too far with my work in terms of trying to be realistic, to realism and emotion. I'm like, damn, I wish I would have been a little more concerned about that actor being in that total darkness. You can't even see his face. Like I could have given that something, so. And then other times I'll do a lot of commercials too, so it's a different world. But not to make this about me, but I'm just saying that as a cinematographer, I really appreciate levels, and I saw the level lighting and execution and cues, lighting cues and theatrical cues and things like that that are fun. That, you know, if you do a West Side Story type thing, you can see the cinematographer being able to have a little more fun.
And when you guys talk about theatrical lighting, for example, like what are you noticing that you would say, oh, that's a theatrical lighting approach in West Side Story?
Well, you see a lighting cue, you know, once you see something go from dark to light out of the blue, that's like a theatrical lighting gag. You know, they did like a gag, you know, it's like the lighting cue that you would see on the stage, you know, that they were able to introduce in some way onto the film.
The other thing too is the colors. You know, sometimes it's like, oh, that's a street light, but it happens to be Lee 101 yellow.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very poppy and very not what you see in the natural world.
An interesting thing to do if you're a young cinematographer is just go on to IMDb and then look at the still frames that the production has put up, right? So you know that they like them. You know that those are frames that someone, and at least in the publicity department, really likes. And think about, okay, can I figure out where every light is and what kind of light it is?
That's an interesting approach.
You have to backwards engineer your brain to, you know, when you see something you like. I think it's really comforting for me to hear, Shawn, you talk about that reality grabbing you and kind of later you thinking, I could have fudged it, because I too have suffered the same exact thought many times. Like, I know they were in a dark room, but why?
I did too much, yeah. Because sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's also fun to, like, for me personally, and maybe you probably do the same thing, Patrick, is once a project is done for me, I'm too much of an obsessive person to even watch it half the time, because I won't sleep. You know, so a lot of times I'll just be like, that's it. I did it. Whatever I did it. If they don't like it, they don't like it. But on the day, I was into it.
Yeah, there's definitely moments in the color correct room where I have to stop myself from saying out loud, "Oh, why did I do that?" That's not the smartest thing in the world to say in front of your bosses, unless you're. I have found with some directors that those conversations actually lead to better collaborations later when you talk about the things that you both screwed up, or when something didn't work out, but then ended up working on the screen. That's always, may your world be full of those, right? Those like, oops, I'm a genius moments, to steal a phrase from Hernan Otaño.
Yeah, but anyway, I love the work of West Side Story. I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to say, I didn't know if this was going to be part of your questions, was I feel like Alice Brooks might have knocked herself out of a nomination by having two great looking musicals in the same year that were very different looking, and a year where we had three really high quality musicals to look at. But that the same person shot Tick, Tick, Boom and In the Heights, pretty incredible. And there were a couple scenes in each of those movies where you're just like, come on, like they're so perfect. Yeah, the swimming pool scene in The Heights is just shocking.
I've never seen it. I gotta watch it.
Oh, it's pretty beautiful, and I got to hear how hard it was to shoot because of the location that they picked. And
Tick Tick Boom also has the pool scene, right?
I'm sorry, that's what it is. Tick Tick Boom is the
Tick Tick Boom is the pool scene.
Both those movies have pool scenes, but I think the Tick Tick Boom is the one that really sets itself apart.
Yeah, that's the one I was talking about. And there's a diner scene. I don't know how best to explain it without giving anything away. There's a diner scene in Tick Tick Boom that is also really wonderful.
No, check it out.
And then there's a scene in The Heights that I'm a huge fan of too, which is it's all in one room, and there's a really long continuous take in it, and just going for where to place the exposure and what to do with what little room for lighting she had, and it's just wonderful, and it's emotional. It feels connected to.
Yeah, for me, that's always the main thing. If it feels like it's supposed to feel, then the technique is not as important to me.
Yeah, exactly right. It feels like really connected to the characters and the stories. So if there was going to be a category in the podcast of people that you wish had been nominated, then I would nominate Alice Brooks for knocking herself out by having two amazing musicals.
I'm going to go back and look at it. That sounds inspirational.
Yeah.
Patrick, you anticipated exactly my next question. If there were other projects in 2021 that didn't make this list but deserved a shout out. So Alice Brooks' work, it's interesting with 2 projects.
Yeah, and I just felt that they were both very, very. They're 2 musicals, but they're very different looking. I mean, Tick Tick Boom feels super gritty, and really, it shot me back to living in a tiny railroad in the 90s when they were affordable. And then In the Heights is completely different feeling. It's a much glossier, along the lines of West Side Story style, much poppier looking colors, and just a very different musical. And that she shot both of those and we got to see them in the same year. It's really fun. And then, West Side Story comes out at the same time. Shawn, was there anything?
I was thinking, I was trying to rack my brain. I can't, with the way my schedule has been lately, I haven't got a chance to see everything,
Working's a good problem.
I got to go back and look at a bunch of stuff.
I thought Belfast was pretty beautiful too, and was surprised it didn't get nominated, but I knew it would be in the mix, and I'm sure if this list was 6, it'd be on it, because that's another. The people's faces in that movie just look phenomenal and really wonderful, and it has a really great sense of moving the way a kid, where the point of view of the story is often based on a child, and that's a whole different. You start thinking about framing in a different way, and the way sunlight kind of got into the houses in that movie, I thought was really beautiful, and not always easy to pull off. And I don't know how much of that was sets versus locations, but some of those are definitely locations based on coming off of the streets. But I think they built a bunch of it so they could have control of these little alley streets, but I don't know what the transitions were from exteriors to interiors. But you can't tell if there are transitions. They're seamless. They work really well.
I'm going to watch Belfast later.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's good.
Well, gentlemen, appreciate you both joining us today. Really enjoyed hearing you guys talk about these films. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Listeners, that's a wrap for the episode, and there's also a wrap for season 11 of the podcast. If you've been a regular listener for the last 5 weeks, we've given you a boatload of behind-the-scenes trivia to share at your Oscar viewing party this weekend. If you've only just joined us recently and don't have time to catch up, no worries. Our insights are evergreen, so catch up on the series whenever it's convenient. You can learn more about the podcast on our website, belowtheline.oneword.biz. That's B-I-Z. It's easy to peruse past episodes, and you'll find links to all of our social media. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and all of you for sticking with us. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends. The specifics for season 12 are still in flux, but I'm planning to experiment with shorter episodes for a while, and we should be ready to launch in a couple of weeks. Come back and let me know what you think. I really appreciate your feedback.
By the way, the lighting in your whole frame is pretty nice there, Patrick. I was looking at.
Oh.
It has a nice little soft key light, and then like a little thing dashing up the back. It's kind of cute. I just look like I'm in a real.
I have been called out in some meetings for curating this background, because if I were to pan this camera anywhere else in this room, it would just be a disaster of like weird stuff.
Yeah, it looks good.
Look, just like stuff laying around.